Welcome to our program in a nutshell. I'm Bob Savakanis. Today we have a special guest in Gina Maria Aleo Gordon. Gina is from the Wilkes-Barre area, born and raised, and she is, as her biography tells us, she's a creative person whose hobbies include hiking, exercising, embroidery, calligraphy, reading, cooking, and baking. But we know her much more as a historian. Gina enjoys history, and has represented 1940s baseball, attending the Lackawanna Historical Society's annual Civil War Ball event, and since 2013, she's had the ultimate privilege of portraying Martha Wales Skelton Jefferson, otherwise known as the wife of our former president, Thomas Jefferson. Gina tells us that speaking about the founding father, Thomas Jefferson, and his legacies and contributions to our nation from his wife's perspective. She not only talks about the historical President Jefferson, but speaks as his wife, opening the doors to his home life, relaying anecdotes about his family and friends, and allowing audiences to see a bigger picture into the life of a former president, Thomas Jefferson. Gina, thank you for being our guest today on our program.
Oh, thank you.
It's a very interesting background, and I know I've seen you several times out in the community performing as Mrs. Thomas Jefferson. I guess the first thing I'm going to ask is, what got you mainly involved in focusing on the life of a president's wife?
I've always been an admirer of Thomas Jefferson. To me, he's just an ultimate Renaissance man, and he reminds me a little bit of myself insofar as that he's just interested in the world around him, and so he read a lot and just visited places and asked people a lot of questions. And so I just long admired him for that, and of course I think he's very charming when you read some of his letters, but also I like him because he came from immense wealth and privilege, but he fought when he used that wealth and the privilege it came with to actually champion, the little person. Just like in our times, you had to be wealthy to attend private schools or to buy books, and he had an issue with that. So when he had the chance and was involved in politics, he championed public schools and public libraries so that everybody had a chance to be educated or learned how to read. And so he did use his influence for things like that.
I know through the years, as I mentioned in the introduction, I've seen you portray Mrs. Jefferson at various events, presentations to the Law Association, the Law Library Association for Attorneys. I've seen you do community groups. Tell us a little bit about how people seek you out and why they seek you out as Mrs. Thomas Jefferson.
Well, firstly, I got involved in this because, again, I'm an admirer of Thomas Jefferson, and then over the years, you just see on the news or read in the tabloids things about him that weren't really quite factual. It seems like what a lot of people hear about him, they don't really know him very well, and some of the information they would get is false, and it just upset me, and I thought, one of these days I'm going to give talks about him and set the record straight. And I said it to myself enough times, and then one day I said, you know what? I'm going to do it, and I'm going to do it as his wife to make it all the more personal. So I approached, Mary Ann at the Historic Society, and I said, I'd like to do this program, and she was on board with doing it. And so instead of just speaking about the historical man, as his wife, I opened the doors into his home life and just tell personal stories and anecdotes about family and friends that was going on while all this history was being made, so that people got a much broader idea of what was going on in his life. And sure enough, people liked that idea of, being drawn into his home life. And I've had people after talks say, I never knew that he had so much going on in his life, that he went through so much. All you hear about is the history, but you don't really know what was going on behind the scenes while all this history was being made. So from that first talk, people just liked the concept, and a lot of other historical-based societies sought me out, and it just kept growing from there as people said, you really need to hear what she has to say. It's pretty interesting, and it's not just your basic cookie-cutter history. And then and I can't believe I'm doing this all these years later. It just amazes me. But, it's not just historic societies or historical-based societies that reached out to me. Like you said, the Bar Association wanted to know a little bit about, his time as a lawyer. I had a garden club say, can you talk about his gardening a little bit? And I even had a women's organization say, well, can you say a little bit more about yourself? You know, he's interesting, but what more can you say about yourself? And it was like, pinch me. People were just, it was growing on its own. And I was just very, very happy for how it's been growing and the interest people had. And people really like the personal stories, by the way. That's the one focus. I even had someone say, can you just tell a lot of personal stories as a program? And of course I accommodate it.
And I think that's one of the unique characteristics about your program. Again, as I've said, I've experienced it several times, is that I don't want to use the term boring, but a dry history lecture or something. You come from the personal perspective of being the wife of a president. How do you research and prepare for these presentations?
For me, it's reading letters, 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 and more letters. They're out there. I don't rely too much on history books or biographies written by other people, because sometimes they put their own bias into it. So pretty much almost everything I say in my talks comes from letters, either that Mr. Jefferson received or that he wrote, just taking it right from the source himself.
So looking at this perspective of the wife of a president, you're out there in the community portraying the wife of the president, and again, I've seen you in very unique period costume, clothing, things like that. Where do you purchase this? How do you prepare? How do you piece it all together to go out there and almost be on stage and presenting?
It was a lot of work, because I reached out to other people who did colonial reenacting, and I said, I need very authentic costuming, and they put me in touch with, I was put in touch with people who knew how to make historically correct costuming. I didn't trust myself to do the sewing myself, because I had to be perfect since I was portraying a historical figure. And so that was a big part of it, and then the other part was just being well versed. I mean, I love my subject. I've been well versed on him for years, and then it was just taking the history and incorporating the personal stories with it. Because even for the law, like the talk I gave on his years as a lawyer, it wasn't just a talk about his time as a lawyer. I still incorporated family stories. That's my hallmark. Everything gets the personal touch.
You know, obviously in our current contemporary times, we're having a lot of controversies about presidential elections and things like that and everything, but what makes President Jefferson relevant in our society 200 plus years later, if you had to pick a topic or two?
I like that he is the champion of the little guy. That's one thing that really admired me about him, is he did use that influence, like the public schools and public libraries, the fact that he sought for freedom of religion, and he just didn't want the people who were privileged to be able to run for offices. Back in our time, you had to have influence to do that, and he said everybody should have the right to do that, and he fought for things like that, and that's what I feel he should be remembered for more than anything, and that's what I try to get through with my talks, because some people don't realize he did that. People were surprised even when I brought up he sought public education. They didn't realize that he was one of the early people to bring that up.
And what is Mrs. Thomas Jefferson known for that is a quality that you advocate for?
It's tough talking about myself, but I had I was treated as an equal by him at home.
Okay.
And
even though we're going back 200 plus years ago.
Yes, and I had a calming effect on him, because he had his public life was very stressful, but when he came home, I made such a very good household that, he was able to unwind and unbend. So around me, he was able to unwind a little bit, and he really appreciated, the comfortable home environment that I made for him, and just the sociable moments I made possible with good family visits. I was well liked by not only, my friends and neighbors, but his family loved me as well, and all his friends liked me. And he appreciated everything I did to maintain that home. And I was very well read and educated. This is one thing people don't realize is Mr. Jefferson, when you look at all the women he associated with, everyone was well read and educated because it wasn't just enough to be a pretty face. We had a 2-year-long courtship because he wanted to know that I was someone he could come home to and have a conversation with. It wasn't just enough that I was I was considered very beautiful for a woman of our time. So that did get me attention. And I had a previous marriage which made me, an established homemaker. So those were indeed good qualities. But there was a 2-year-long courtship which was very unheard of for our time. And it's because we spent time together and getting to know one another. He wanted to know that we were compatible. Because again, it wasn't just enough that I was able to fulfill, my housewifery duties or to have a pretty face. He wanted someone he could come home to and have a conversation with. And he did indeed discuss politics with me on the side. So he did trust me very much with those matters.
Well, I think our audience is being treated to the first person as Gina, as Mrs. Thomas Jefferson, which it's very interesting. And again, I've seen your presentations, and it just blows me away how you can recite his life and go through what it was like living in that period as Mrs. Jefferson, wife of the president. Let's talk a little bit about Gina, if we can.
All right.
So obviously we've spoken about Mrs. Jefferson a lot and the character that you have portrayed. I know you also were involved with 1940s baseball a little bit, and just reading a little bit about your bio and everything. You love our local history. Tell us a little bit about Gina herself, what some of these other things involve.
Actually, I think 40s baseball was one of my earliest forays into reenacting because I used to go to a lot of World War II reenactments with my father and my sisters. And I enjoyed it because you see the reenactors walking around in, their period costuming, and it was fascinating. But I wasn't interested in the military aspects of it. I liked civilian. So I started showing up at reenactments just in period dresses and hats. But then I thought I wanted to take it one step further and realize there was 40s baseball, So, yeah, I'm a racing belle. We won what's considered the first World Series for women's baseball. Okay. So I started out doing that, and then I just delved a little bit into Civil War, mainly the Civil War ball. That was one of my first ones that the Lackawanna Historic Society sponsors. And that was a lot of fun, and I did go to Gettysburg once as, in Civil War garb. So I was delving a little bit into that, but a lot of that has gone on the back burner since 2013 when Thomas Jefferson took over my whole life. So I haven't done as much of those lately, and I'm not complaining because I'm very happy that people want to hear about Thomas Jefferson. It seems like he's taken over my life in a good way.
So 1940s baseball, why is that relevant for women in baseball in the 1940s?
It's just a very fascinating time, I think, for women in that time because they played professional baseball. Okay. They literally played baseball. Mainly
because of the war effort of World War II going on at that point?
Yes, the men were at war, so the women were recruited to play baseball.
Okay. So then we look at the Civil War ball that you mentioned earlier, and again, I've seen some of those events in which the couples, the people attending these balls are just dressed immaculately from that time period and everything. So what are your thoughts on what the wardrobe was like then as opposed to what we're at now, or the changing styles and everything, just from that perspective?
Oh, I like the wardrobes. I really do. That's one of the perks of being involved in reenacting. Actually, I wish we could go back to some of those old ways.
Can you describe a little bit about what your wardrobe would look like? A hoop skirt, things like that, I believe is a part of it?
Yes, there is the hoop underneath, and it actually collapses. So, yeah, when you sit down, it just collapses around you. And, yeah, just very full skirts and a lot of structure.
So people now think they have a hard time getting dressed for work in the morning or something.
It's a lot of layers, even for colonial. It's a lot of layers and a lot of structure, but I think it automatically makes an outfit just because of the structure. Even in the 1940s clothes, there's a lot of structure to it. So as soon as you put one outfit on, you're set to go.
So as Mrs. Jefferson and or some of the other, I don't say characters, but 1940s baseball, let's say, as an example or something, has this taken you, besides northeastern Pennsylvania, you mentioned Gettysburg, has it taken you beyond our area as Mrs. Jefferson and other individuals? And if so, what were some of these encounters like, or what was your travels like?
Oh, it's been fun. I went as far north as Vermont to a history fair where I got to walk the grounds and greet people. That was fun because it's very unexpected. And I've been to different parts of Pennsylvania, and I've been to Maryland multiple times.
Why Maryland, if I could ask?
I've been invited down there many times. It just, by word of mouth, just kept growing and growing, and just being part of banquets and garden society programs. It's just a fun, but I really enjoy it because you never know what to expect, the people you'll meet. And I've been to places I never knew existed. So it's been a very fun experience, just the different people I meet and learning a little bit about those other places. And actually I also did an elementary school too, and that was fascinating.
Why?
Because I was just amazed at the questions these children asked. They would ask some of the most intelligent questions I ever heard, and it was a lot of fun to be around them because you're not sure if they're listening, but by golly, they were, and they asked a lot of good questions based on what I had to say. In fact, one little girl, I'll never forget this question because I never would have thought of this myself. But I just mentioned, I died young, and Mr. Jefferson became a single parent, which was unusual for our time, because usually men would remarry because usually it's the men who had the jobs and the women took care of the household and the children. Well, he never remarried, which made him a single father to young children. And so he did get a lot of help because he did have his day job, so he did get help from family and friends. But one little girl did ask, well, if you were dead and he was a single parent, who took care of the children during the day? And it gave me the opportunity to tell people how, family and friends stepped in to help. So it was just amazed that she picked up on that.
So going back then to President Jefferson, Mr. Jefferson and everything, most of our viewers and most of the public is aware of his presidency. But can you give us a little bit more of a background of Thomas Jefferson, the man, as far as his life? He was an attorney, you mentioned as well. A couple other things, if you could fill us in on that maybe we're not aware of. Yeah,
he did start out in life as an attorney. He practiced attorney, was in courts with clients. And then he was elected to the House of Burgesses, and that was his foray into politics. And then from there it grew, and then he was elected to the Continental Congress, and that drew him a lot of national attention. And then he was involved in helping draft the Declaration of Independence. And then he was governor of Virginia after that, and he didn't feel he was equipped to be a governor during wartime, but he was honored that he was chosen to do it. And then he was made minister to France. It's the equivalent now of being an ambassador to a country, and he loved his time there because it was shortly after I died that he was sent there, so it was a physical break from, what he knew here in the States, but he just liked his time there and really liked that job. And he traveled extensively while he was there. He met King Louis and Marie Antoinette, among other people. And then from there, as everyone knows, he became Secretary of State under George Washington and became Vice President to John Adams and ultimately President. So it was like a big whirlwind for him.
So just following through with that life of his, then you mentioned children. How many children total did you have with him?
On behalf of myself, I had 7 children because I did have one with my first husband, but with Mr. Jefferson, there were 6.
6 children.
And only 2 of those lived to adulthood.
So Mr. Jefferson then, after his presidency, what did his life become?
Oh, after the president, he actually was in his element finally because politics and public life really consumed him. He wasn't very comfortable in the public. He really was a private man and was more comfortable at home and doing home-side pursuits when he could. Like the portraiture you see of him in those fancy suits, that wasn't what he was like. As soon as he got home, he put on the oldest clothes he could find, and he was out mucking around the farms and his gardens because that's where he was in his element. So when he retired, he was finally able to focus on all that exclusively. And by the time he retired, he was a great-grandfather, so he was elated. So he finally had time to spend time with our adult, daughter Martha, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren. He finally had time to work full-time on his gardens and his, focus on his farming and his books. So he was in his element when he was in retirement, because it was finally time for him to do what he wanted to do for him. He wasn't being called, to serve his country.
So in all your years of research and being Mrs. Jefferson in our times, what do you think was one of his proudest accomplishments in his career? And it sounds like a very long and it is a very long and distinguished career.
Now, one big accomplishment he liked was the establishment of the University of Virginia, again, because he believed in education. So he was thrilled when he was able to open that, and then the Religious Freedom Act that he helped pass, and also being part of the Declaration of Independence, helping write that and being the primary author.
And the title of one of our founding fathers of the United States.
Yes, which I don't know if they realized that, and they were where they were heading in history when they did what they did.
And just by the listing that you just went through, I mean, it sounds to me as if when we look at our elected officials now, their life is pretty easy compared to all the things that Mr. Jefferson, President Jefferson's life involved and was involved with as far as his entire career. Getting back to Gina again then, so I just look at the situation that you're out there doing these presentations and everything. Tell us a little bit about what it's like for that presentation. So if I was interested in attending this, how would it begin, and what is the procedure and the background, a little bit about it? What is the presentation as Mrs. Jefferson?
I usually just ask people, the nature of their organization, and I usually recommend for the first program, if they don't have any suggestions, just to do an overview of his life, because then you get a little bit of an idea of, it's hard putting, 80 good plus years into, a time frame, but it's still possible to just, just to get an overview, and then people can take it from there and fine tune it from there if they're ever interested in any specific part of his life. And then I just usually ask, where the venue's going to be, and, what kind of costuming would be required. Usually I go dressed up in, more a formal dress, which is something I wouldn't have normally worn in my day-to-day life, being, a household mistress of 4 plantations. But, whenever I give a presentation, it is a formal occasion, so I do get dressed up unless the occasion calls for more day wear. But I usually go over these details with the client. And I do try to stay away from podiums and microphones, because I like to be free to mingle with, the clients, audiences.
So you mentioned as far as programs go, so do you offer a variety of programs, topics? I mean, are there specific ones that you can address, or?
Yes, I do. There's the overview, and I have, for a 30-minute program up to 45 minutes, because some people are interested in having longer programs, and I do go over that with clients too. It's like, how much time would you like me to speak? Because then I could fine-tune things for me, because if I don't do an outline, I can talk and talk and talk about him, because it's just so easy. So I do try to have an outline going into a talk, so I stay focused on, what the client is interested in hearing, because it's easy. It's with the history and the personal stories to just go off on so many tangents. But I have the overview. I have a little talk, just about me specifically and my relationship with him and my role in his life. I have the talk about, his time as a lawyer, one on his gardening. I have one that's chock full of personal stories, which people love, because I do talk about the children, and a lot was going on in their lives. And I take it from there. I mean, a lot of the different programs I come up with have been requested by people, even just talking about, Christmas traditions in colonial times.
Do you get a lot of interaction with the people at your programs, as far as a lot of Q&A, trying to find out even more, or do you feel that people are more kind of blown away by all the information that you gave them?
Sometimes it starts out that way, but I encourage people to ask questions, because even if people are sitting at the end and not sure, I'll tell them, ask me, you could ask me any questions, or if you don't want to ask now, they could ask me in private. But I do encourage interaction. I enjoy it, actually, because then sometimes it brings out things that I didn't get a chance to talk about, or I could elaborate. But when I do give my presentations, if at all possible, I love just mingling in and out with crowds, just so people, can see me up close, and I'm not just some stationary person in front of a podium not moving. I try to make it very personal. I love the crowds.
Obviously, prior to the COVID health situation that we're encountering the last several months and for a while longer, I'm assuming, but historical reenactors, historical portrayals, things like that, was there a large growing market for that over the last several years, that people want to remember, relive the history of what things were like at one time? Your thoughts on that?
I think there is. I think the fact that I've been doing this since 2013 is a good indication of that. It's like a renewed interest in, the founding and learning a little bit about American history, and in a very personal way. And just learning, a little bit more about one of the founding fathers that people never really heard about, because sometimes you read a history book or you read some, a little clip in a magazine, and it's not always the whole story. And I'm able to go somewhere in person, and I can say, ask me questions, and I can talk about things. And like I said, I encourage questions. So then it could be very as personal as people would like, but people have been very responsive. So I do think there still is a market, because I think people really want to know where we came from.
Okay, so let's go back to Gina the person again and talk a little bit about, so you're in high school and you're, growing up as a child and everything. Did you ever think that you'll be doing something like this, portraying a presidential wife?
Never. And as much as I admired Thomas Jefferson back then, I never thought I'd even be talking about him. It's just something that in the past, the past decade, where I just felt very defensive of him and just felt the need to talk about him more, and then I made it all the more personal. But I never would have thought I would get up in front of crowds and do what I'm doing and have it. But I think everything happens at a certain time for a reason. I'm not sure if I started it back then, if it would be as successful. I'm not sure why, but I think this is the time to be doing it.
So through your years of doing this and everything, any unique stories that you want to share with us about, this was a unique adventure that I did, a unique location, something really interesting happened that out of the norm? Any interesting stories over the years?
There's just a lot of different things, like just last year, just being on a train ride and hopping from car to car, which was very interesting because I have never done that before, and just giving little clippets of talks on him, and just every car was a different experience because you never know who you're going to meet. And it was fascinating just talking to a garden club and talking about him and just the personal experiences, and they learned a few things too because they thought it was fascinating. Because sometimes, even as I'm giving my talk, instead of just telling people things, I'll say, "You'll never guess who came up with this idea to do something." And some people would answer, and I'd say, "Wrong. It was Thomas Jefferson. He was the one who, designed the blueprints for this." And
you mentioned earlier about, as far as your research goes and everything, and you said letters rather than textbooks and things like that. What does letters mean, and where do you acquire this information about letters from 200 years ago or so?
Oh, there's multiple volumes, the papers of Thomas Jefferson, where meticulously being put into book format were letters that because he saved his correspondence. He saved every letter he received, and he kept copies of every letter he sent out. And people meticulously took those letters and put them into book form to save them for posterity's sake. And you could purchase these books, and I have, because to me, that's how you get to know the real man, because it's all there in letters. That's why when some people come up to me and say, "Well, he's such a mystery," and I said, "But Just read the letters. It's a lot to read because obviously it's sorry because I mean he started doing this when he was in his late 20s and he lived into to his so there's 60 some years worth of letters constantly back and forth. So it's a lot to read. But there's so much you could learn from them. Just, you know, what people wrote to him and how he responded and vice versa. It's all there.
So do you find as your program continues to go on, your programs, that you find a lot more new revelations in your research, or is it kind of plateaued at this point, or do you think there's a lot more to continuously to discover about President
There's
Jefferson?
more to discover because for how much I read there's so much more I haven't read yet because there's so much. I have to admit, one of the most fascinating things I read in more recent times is a lot of people say, you know, Thomas Jefferson had a favorite daughter. He preferred Martha over Mary because Mary was more like him. And I found out the first person in history to wonder about that was Mary herself. She wrote her father a letter and I'm paraphrasing, just said, well, I suppose you do prefer, you know, my sister over me because she's more like you. And he wrote her back and he said, don't be silly. He said, I love you both for who you are. And so he nipped that in the bud right there in a letter back to her saying, you know, he loved her equally for who she was, even if she wasn't exactly like her sister, because that was fine with him. So you find these, and you read in a letter, this came from France, the Battle of Wyoming. He learned about it when he was minister to France because there was a Frenchman here who was an eyewitness to it and wrote about it, and he got his hands on that manuscript.
And there's our
and
connection.
He wrote about it in a letter, and he mentioned, you know, what happened in Wyoming.
And that's our connection to northeastern Pennsylvania, President Jefferson.
Yes, he learned about the Battle of Wyoming.
So do we look at this as a career or do we look at this as a hobby from Gina's perspective?
I'd love to make a bigger career out of it, but I'm just happy I can do what I'm doing right now. So now it's more of a glorified hobby, but I'd love to take it even further if I can, but I'm happy with where it's been going. Like I said, I never dreamed I'd be doing this from 2013 on. When I did my first ever talk, since it was so new to me, I thought, okay, this is either going to go over very well or I may have to run out the back door. And I was just amazed. It went over very well, and everything grew from word of mouth from that day.
You mentioned dealing with some school children on programs and things like that. What would be your words to our children, our generations growing up and everything, as far as learning about our country's history, President Jefferson or anything like that? How would you encourage this to happen?
I don't know how, but I would try to just make sure in all the schools that we really should learn about our early history, and not just Thomas Jefferson. You know, be well versed on George Washington and John Adams and his contributions, all of them, and you know, where we came and how we came to be where we are today. Because it's very important not to forget, you know, where we got started and how we got started. Because otherwise we lose sight of everything, you know, what, you know, the founding fathers did on our behalf. I mean, many of them, I mean, even Thomas Jefferson, you know, had the death penalty over his head because they were considered treasonous to the British government. So when they, you know, all signed that Declaration of Independence, they were considered traitors. And they had death threats over their heads, and they knew that. And they did that because of what they believed in and what they wanted for us.
Well, I want to thank you, Gina Aleo Gordon, for being our guest today on our program. And thank you for being out in the community and educating the public about President Jefferson and all the historical programming that you're involved with, and the reenactment, and just keeping history alive for us here in northeastern Pennsylvania. I'm Bob Savakinas. Thank you for tuning into our program in a nutshell.